Hey, it's your best friend. I miss you. Okay, we're up to number 12 in our notes. We're gonna talk about flowers this time. Flowers are where it's at. Um, they're so nice and they smell so beautiful and they appeal to so many senses. They look nice. Eh, they sound gorgeous and delicious. Anyways, flowers have four major parts. They're all modifications of leaves, okay? Like evolutionarily modified leaves. So we've got sepals, petals, stamens, carpels. We will discuss all of these, but these are our four parts. So in the remaining space of number 12, we're going to go ahead and discuss some of these in not great detail, but a little bit. We're going to label them on number 13 of our notes. I've got a nice color picture for you to label the parts. All right, and then we'll talk some more detail about stamen and carpel and the process of fertilization in plants. And that's what we're doing today. This is this is this is the church. This is the sepal. Open the doors and see all the ovules. Sepals, for number 12 to describe them. These are little protective structures. You can see where they're labeled on here. So is that A through J? Yes, but which one is it? B. B for birds. Start with that one. Those are the sepals. All right, so that's number 13 where I'm labeling it for you. But for number 12, we're answering some stuff about it. So sepals are these little protective structures that protect a developing flower. Okay. Want to see some good examples? Watch this. Smelled so good. So what in petals? Petals are just these little pretty things, and their function is entirely to attract, all right, to attract pollinators, right? Birds, bees, bats, whatever. Um, so number 12, I want you to describe petals to me. Pretty. That's really it. That's really it. They're pretty. They're to look attractive. That's exactly all they are. So if you're labeling this, this is A on our diagram for number 13. Okay. Okay, so here's where things are gonna get a little funky because we're gonna bounce around in our notes between 12 and 13 and 14 or 12 and 13 and 15. So for 12, the easiest way to summarize this statement is male parts of a flower. Okay, so what I want you to do is just that can go into space for 12, but we're going to go into a little more detail on 14. So first, let's label the parts of them. All right, the male parts of a flower. We've got J is referring to the stamen. All right. It's easy to remember it's the man part of the flower because it has men in it. Stamen, men, male. All right. And it's consisting of H and I. H is something called the anther, and I is something called the filament. Okay. You've got that now. Now on the next slide, well, I'll tell you what, I'll tell you later. All right, so you've got a general answer for stamen described in 12, right? The man part of a flower. This flower have both male and girl part. 13, you've got the stamen labeled an anther and a filament, right? That's J, H, and I. So for 14, let's talk a little bit more about stamen and its component parts. So the stamen, the man part, right, consists of two parts, the anther and the filament. So what do each of them do? The anther is where you have meiosis to make pollen. All right, so anther makes pollen. Got it. The filament simply holds up the anther so it's elevated. Right, so this is convenient because if the anthers are making pollen, they have covered with pollen, and a pollinator flies on in, right? A bee flies on in, zoop. It's on its way in, it's going to get pollen all over it because the filaments hold them up. Okay, so in summary, if I were to ask you the following question, what part of a flower is responsible for producing pollen grains? What would your response be? Please tell me what you're thinking. Explain yourself. I'll give you a second, or maybe several seconds, for you to discuss. Have you thought of some responses yet? You say you seem to have forgotten the question? Well, the question was, what part of a flower is responsible for producing pollen grains? What's the answer? That's right, it's the anther. The anther is the anther. Pew! The pistil. Ah, the pistil. What the hey is a pistil? It's a synonym for the carpel, the female part of a flower. So on number 12, you just tell me the carpel, aka pistil, you should know that aka, is the female part of a flower. So let's talk about those parts and get them up and labeled on number 13. So there it is on the right side of your diagram, labeling F. This is the pistil / carpel. All right, so that's F. And it consists of 3 little individual pieces, which we will discuss on number 15. So I'm sorry we're bouncing around, but you'll live. All right, we've got the stigma, the style, and the ovary. These are the 3 parts of the pistil, aka carpel. All right, stigma, style, ovary. We're going to discuss those in just a moment. Stay tuned. All right, so here we are, 15. Let's talk about the stigma. The stigma, you can see, is held way up high in a flower. It is sticky. Remember this, sticky stigma. I'll do that without clapping so you can hear me. Sticky stigma. Okay, why is it sticky? For pollen to get stuck on it, you idiot. I'm just kidding, you're not an idiot. All right, we also have the style, right? You've got this thing labeled, it's letter D. You've got this already on number 13. So your style, its job is to hold up the stigma so it's elevated, right? You want this thing far away from your anthers because, well, you want to avoid pollinating yourself. Nasty. Okay? All right, the last part. There's a squirrel on my roof. He's crawling around up here. You can't see him. Trust me, there's a ding-dang squirrel crawling around up there. Where were we? Ovary. The stigma style, the ovary. So the ovary is letter E, right? But the ovary, right, the swollen base of the flower, it contains our ovules. And you can label ovules now, which are a component of the ovary. They are letter G in our diagram. And I believe that takes us to the end of all the things you should have labeled on number 13 on that pretty little flower drill ring. Okay, so we've got stigma style ovary. Ovary contains the ovules. Ovules are those eggs that will be fertilized later, hopefully. Okay, so that's going to make our female gametophyte is the technical word. Ovules are the eggs, all right? So they are going to be the, once they get fertilized, the plant embryos. Flower overview. Got it? All right, so 16. So I should point out the short answer is no, right? That's because not all flowers are typical where that have both male and female parts. Some species of plants have male gametophytes and female gametophytes. You couldn't see that. I was putting out my hands like this on opposite sides to indicate they're different. But it was. So I guess 16 is just, you just go ahead and say no. All the day. So all this reproduction in angiosperms, these are flowering plants, right? This takes place within the flower. We're going to take some time to break that down. We're going to discuss the actual reproductive process in flowers, and I find it fascinating. I think before we can do that, yeah, I'll add this in a second. I'm going to have to get to the whiteboard and explain to you some meiosis thing, okay? Yeah. Yeah, so come for that. That'll be here in a second. And then we'll discuss that whole process of fertilization and some of the consequences of it, okay? Okay. Here at the whiteboard, let's talk meiosis. All right, so meiosis. Here he is. Meiosis. So it's this process that makes our gametes, right? Well, I want to tell you a little bit about this. So we're going to start with a cell. It's called a germ cell. It is diploid. So we describe it as 2N diploid. What's diploid mean? 2 copies of chromosomes. So it is like all the cells in your body, you have 2 copies of chromosomes. Where'd you get each of those copies? Where you get each of those sets? One from mom, one from dad. 1 + 1 is 2. You got it. Okay. You're going to have, in meiosis, you start with this germ cell. It's diploid. It's going to go through a cell division that will make 2 haploid cells. Okay? But we're not done. These haploid cells, this is meiosis part 1. We're going to go through meiosis 2. And each of these 2 cells is going to undergo another division. Now these are still haploid, right? Because you don't go less than 1. Still have to have a set of chromosomes. But there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens here. If you remember from Bio 1, this is where, during meiosis 1, right? This is where we have crossing over happening during prophase 1 of meiosis. This gives us a lot of interesting new combinations of genes. We have when these homologous pairs line up in the middle of our cell. We've got, they can line up in lots of different orientations depending on how many chromosomes you have, like lots of different possibilities once they separate in anaphase 1. We call that our independent assortment. Look, there are, since we have, side note, since we have 23 chromosomes, there are 2 to the 23rd ways for those chromosomes to line up in the middle of our cell during meiosis 1. And because of that, we get over 8 million different combinations. So it explains why you and your full siblings, all right, I'm talking about full siblings, are different from each other even if you have the same parents, right? Because you get the same genes from your parents, yes, mostly, but they combine in these different unique ways, all right? So thank you, because then we can get variation. All right, so there's our general overview of meiosis. But wait, there's more, because it's different for males and females. Now, if meiosis is happening in a male,
what are these final products, right? We start with a germ cell that's diploid. We end up with 4 haploid. That's right. These are sperm, all right? And they're more or less equivalent in terms of like functionality. They're all going to be a little bit different from each other genetically, but they're all the same size. They all work the same way, essentially, okay? 4 more or less equivalent sperm cells. Now, again, equivalent doesn't mean genetically identical. They're all different from each other because we had crossing over up here. We had independent assortment up here, all right? Things got funky. But these are all 4 sperm, right? As a result of 1 meiotic round of division from our initial germ cell. Okay. Things get different in female meiosis. All right, so here it is. In female meiosis, maybe I'll use a different one. No, I like this one. It's plum. So in female meiosis, you go through the same process, but in female meiosis, they make this, they make this, they make this. And each of these 3 things are called polar bodies. And they're pretty much useless, okay? In animals, anyways, they're completely useless. These 3 polar bodies are just kind of reabsorbed. And this, which is the egg, right? That's the important one. So essentially, in male meiosis, you make 4 more or less equivalent in terms of size sperm. In females, they put all the resources into just one of the 4 cells that are made at the end of meiosis, and that is what our egg is. That is our ovule, okay? So it's like female meiosis puts all our eggs in one basket. Is that a good joke? Yes. These polar bodies in animals, not used. In plants, things are about to get funky. So I'm going to reference these polar bodies here coming up. So stay tuned and don't forget about my polar bodies. Wow.
Okay, hope you enjoyed your meiosis lesson. We're going to use that now. So thanks for sticking around through that little whiteboard session. All right, so number 18, we'll talk about this fertilization process. Step 1, got broken down into 6 steps. Step 1, pollen shows up, all right? Pollen grain is going to show up and land on a sticky stigma. How's it going to get there? Well, in flowers, pollinators bring it, right? There's a bee that shows up. He's got pollen stuck on his leg. On his way into the flower, he's going to brush on that sticky stigma, and some of that pollen's going to come off, get stuck, okay? So step 1, there it is. Our pollen shows up. Then it starts growing a pollen tube. All right, it's going to grow this little road down through this style. All right, so step 1, pollen grain shows up, starts growing something called a pollen tube. Step 2 of 18, number 18 in our notes. Step 2 is we have this pollen tube grow all the way down the entire length of the style, however long that happens to be, and enters the ovary, and then fuses with an individual ovule, okay? So we can talk about lots and lots of pollen tubes because each ovule eventually, we'll see this, will become a seed. So we'll see a lot of different pollen grains attaching and growing pollen tubes through this style, okay? So this is step 2. All right, step 3 is now we've basically created a road from the stigma all the way through the style to into the ovary to connect to an ovule. So what happens is sperm travels this road, right? Sperm is in the pollen, right? Goes all the way down through the pollen tube and fuses with an ovule, with an egg, right? This forms a diploid zygote, right? Sperm plus egg equals zygote, because I know you love things in mathematical terms. All right, so step 4 is this zygote develops into the plant embryo. That's the baby. So we did it. We made the plant baby. What? There are 2 more steps? Mysterious. Okay, so now things are a little funky. So what happens is a second sperm shows up, right? He came down that pollen tube. He shows up and he's like, "Ah, oh, beans, I missed it. Everybody's fertilized down here. Shoot." But all is not lost, second and late to the party sperm. What we're going to do is you're going to go ahead and fuse with a couple of polar bodies. In here in the notes, they're called polar nuclei. That's another way to call them polar bodies. Remember, these products of meiosis in a female. In animals, these polar bodies just go away. In plants, they hang around and a second sperm fuses with them. So think about that for a second. It makes something that is a triploid tissue. Tri means 3, right? So you've got the sperm set of chromosomes and then a set of chromosomes from one polar body and another polar body. That's 3 sets of chromosomes. Why? What? Why is this happening? It's magic of Mother Nature. She's one bad mother. So this happens. What does this triploid tissue do? It develops into a super nutrient-rich layer, excuse me, called endosperm. This is the name for this food-rich tissue layer. This endosperm eventually surrounds the developing embryos, the seeds. Okay, so let's think about endosperm for 1 second. Think about an apple. Picture an apple in your mind, okay? Or maybe even have one with you. You know what apples look like. So it's got all this fruit, and then the seeds are in the core on the inside. Unless you're a weirdo, you don't eat the actual core of the apple. There are some of you out there who I bet do. Like I bet Idana has definitely eaten a apple core before. Yeah, if I had to guess one person, that's who it would be. I know Mr. O'Brien does. That's probably not surprising to anybody either. Anyways, so we've got the seeds on the inside of the apple in the core, right? And it's surrounded by all this food, nutrient-rich tissue. That's endosperm. That stuff is there to provide nutrition to developing babies. If that apple were to fall on the ground, it's like built-in fertilizer, right? As it breaks down and composts, those seeds will use all the nutrients that are in that triploid endosperm and use them to sprout into a new apple tree, okay? Plus, it's attractive to creatures to come eat them, right? Lots of seed dispersal happens because, a bird shows up, gulps down a fruit, flies away, dukes out the seeds somewhere else, right? So that endosperm is nutrient rich for the developing seed, but it's also there to be an attractant to disperse the seeds. It's magical. All right, so what we did is we talked about here all that nonsense with polar bodies. We made sense of it, and the embryo happens because we have a pollen sperm fused with an egg. It's crazy. It's all crazy. Let's summarize. Okay, so 19. We call this whole process in flowering plants, we call it a double fertilization. Why is that? Because we had 2 different sperm involved, right? Sperm 1 fused with the embryo. Nope. Sperm 1 fused with the ovule to make the seed. That's the embryo, that's the baby plant. Sperm 2 fused with 2 polar bodies to make the triploid endosperm. Is that weird? Yes, that is weird. But you should also know all that delicious fruit juice and all these pies that you eat, it's you enjoying the sweet, sweet taste and texture of triploid endosperm. So good. That's a good fact for you. So let's talk about how pollen gets around. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it because some of this we already know. So number 20, how does pollination differ between gymnosperms and angiosperms? Well, in angiosperms, we know in gymnosperms it's wind, right? We've mentioned this before. It's wind that disperses the pollen. In angiosperms, it's pretty much animals, right? It's little bugs. It's flies and bees and butterflies and such. Hummingbird faces, things like that. All right, so it's pretty much just animals. So I've got a little bit more on number 21 to illustrate this. Okay, so let's talk about a couple points about wind pollination. I'll just pop them up there. So it's not very efficient. That makes sense, right? It's not targeted. If you have pollen just blowing around in the air, what's the chance that pollen from one pine tree is going to get on the seed cone from another pine tree of the same species? Low. It's low. So it's not an efficient process. So pine trees just crank out lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of pollen, right? Right? Hedging their bets. It also, of course, relies on weather. On still days, how does pollen get around in a gymnosperm? It doesn't. So luckily, it's pretty windy in the spring, right? When usually this is happening. So not a big deal. Animal pollination, on the other hand, much more efficient, right? Because we have attractive, targeted process. Okay, so we've got flowers that are bright and beautiful and pretty, and I'll talk to you a bit about flowers. Look bright and beautiful and pretty to us, yes, but they look drastically different to pollinators, birds and bugs, because they see in the ultraviolet part of the spectrum. So more on that later. It's interesting. Plus the fact that animal pollination is beneficial to both parties. So why would a bee show up or a hummingbird show up to a flower? It's because there's a little nectar reward. There's some sugar water that's high in energy and it's tasty. So the bees show up, they eventually make it into honey. The hummingbirds eat it and they make it into, well, they just eat it. They don't make it into things. They eat it so they can support their high metabolisms. All right. So those benefit your pollinators, and the pollinators benefit the flowers because they get targeted, very efficient pollination. So there's our plant reproduction stuff. I think it's pretty fascinating. Okay. Any questions? You guys all got it? Got it? Josh, wake up. What a joker. Secrets. Today's secret is brought to you by my childhood and me being a bad older brother, basically. I guess this is a theme, isn't it? Wait, have I talked about those yet? No. When I was a kid, we had a bench in our dining room, kind of like bay window area style. And it was my spot. My favorite spot was to sit on the bench near the window. And that was for several reasons. One was because when there was food I didn't like, in particular lima beans, I would very discreetly remove the lima beans, drop them behind me on the bench, and then shove them behind the back of the bench onto the floor where they would, well, I never thought about them again. They would just dry up and get crunchy, and no one ever noticed them. And so I got away with that for years. And at some point, my parents cleaned that out and noticed all the food back there. And they're like, what the crap is going on? And my sister admitted to putting some food that she didn't want back behind the bench when she was eating. And so I did not admit to also contributing that for about 20 years. But now everyone knows, and now it's just fun family stuff. Anyways, I did let my sister take the fall for me when she was about 10 or 12. And I do feel a little bit bad about that. Sorry, Anna.